you're gonna, the agency and the public is gonna start to hear some things about a history that is not normally out there. Everything from, and I talked a little bit about this at the staff meeting, everything about this agency opening up as a whites-only agency that a year later began to serve Black children in a segregated fashion, to testimony in one of the case in Virginia was called Davis versus the Prince Edward County Board of Education, which was one of the 5 cases that led up to Brown. And the testimony of ChildSavers medical director in 1952 really said that children should be served in a segregated way. So he was anti-desegregation at the time. So that testimony is now part of the Brown record, as we were the Memorial Child Guidance Clinic at that time. It was interesting to learn about our service to adults in the early years and the build out from the flu pandemic in 1918. And then the falling off of adult services to focus on children and the creation of prevention services in the 1980s. But they're step-throughs that really have a racial lens to them, particularly in the community that we grew up in. One of our early locations was in Highland Park, and the department that served Black children was in the basement with no natural light, hidden away from the public. So all of that is part of our history that I think it's important for us to start to talk about. And a lot of it I'm learning because I'm reading a lot more than I read when I took the job eight years ago. And so I'm going to start sharing that in presentations and proposals that we put together. And it is fascinating history that I think is really important for us to let the public know about. I will tell you all a funny story. So when I first took this job, I reached out to elected officials and particularly Black elected officials that represented this community, and at the federal level and the state level. And one of those officials, who will remain nameless for now, said to me, "So you're going to run the racist organization ChildSavers?" I was like, "Whoa, I've only been here 3 weeks. Give me a chance." And what she was referring to is some of that history that I wasn't aware of, and how this organization has turned a corner from serving majority white children to majority Black children. And I think that's important for people to recognize. I'm going to do a presentation to the Kiwanis Club of Richmond, which is going to talk about our history over time. And we'll begin to share this more and more in the community. So when Voices came up with the idea of race and reconciliation, obviously I think I heard it from Katie. Was it from you? Or I heard, yeah, Katie shared it with the group. I was absolutely fascinated that and thought we should participate in some way. And an idea that has been on my mind in conversations that I've had in select ways with my colleagues who are Caucasian is wondering about what I had earmarked as stepping up or stepping into the conversation without a movement, and or not stepping up for whatever reason you chose. And so I wanted to explore some of that with you all. And I think part of it is you all hear me talk a lot about my life. You all have heard me talk about treading several paths or living 2 lives. And you probably hear this from those you know who are also people of color and especially Black folks about living in these 2 worlds, even though we're in 2020. So I was curious about the world that some of our white clinical staff live in that may be of different experiences. And I think it's important to share with the public because I believe, rightly or wrongly, I do believe that reconciliation cannot happen without truth and without sharing some of this stuff. and trying to achieve understanding. And around race, it's often those who we think would be our, what's the word that people are using these days to talk about people who are not people of color, allies. But I think I heard the term accomplices is more of what I think people like me are looking for. We've got enough ally supporters, but we need people to be accomplices that will really step in and say, that's wrong. And I don't know if you all, I'm talking a lot, but I wanted to give us some context. You all watched any of Congressman Lewis's funeral or his going away service, and the famous words he said over and over again: if you see something, say something, do something. And oftentimes I think we, meaning Black people of my generation, and I think prior, that even those who were allies or allies to us didn't say anything. And you've all heard me talk about dehumanization of Black folks, and me in particular in my personal experience. And so I'm curious about some thinking that you all might have around these topics. So Jan,
yes.
You've got a couple of minutes. Tell me about Jan.
Well, I think growing up, like most of the rest of us, you know, I lived in a part of the country where I didn't see other minorities. You know, it was a non-issue because of the segregation. You know, I was born in 1952. I was in my teens during the height of the civil rights movement, but still in Oklahoma, very distant. So I feel like I certainly grew up with those same implicit biases. I remember in high school being asked out by a Black student from another high school and being very interested, and we went on a couple of dates, and my parents blew up. You know, they were supposedly were not racist, but they were, you know, and I was really discouraged. So I would say through all those years, you know, I just lived in a similar, I don't know, Midwestern household that just really avoided the whole issue because I wasn't close to anyone, you know. Then I think my biggest shift was going out of the country. And I feel like that was an incredible opportunity for the 12 years we're out of the country, of living on the edges of cultures. So it gave me a glimpse. You know, I feel like that was a really lucky thing to have gotten to do, although it was hard, stressful work. But it gave me that experience of living on the edges of a culture, you know. And I think of that as helping, but in no way replaces the experience of being a minority. But it gave me a glimpse into that. I think that's been really helpful for me. At one point, I was thrown into a situation where the other people that were supposed to guide me to building a program in a refugee camp got kicked out of the country due to a political incident. So I had to rely on the Cambodian staff that I'd worked with previously that were there. And the best thing that did was I didn't know the language, I didn't know the culture, so I couldn't participate fully, so I could stay out of their way. You know, I learned just to shut up and listen, you know, and figured out culturally how they could communicate to me what they needed, and then I could go back, you know, to the people in the camp and get what they needed. But they were truly, you know, needed to run the program. So I felt like that was invaluable for me to learn how to do that, to really, whatever population, community we're working with, to really figure out what they needed first and not try to assume, put any assumptions on it. I think leading up to now, just to kind of be brief, is at this particular point, I feel like I'm learning all over again that this is a process. There's no reaching cultural competency. And to me, that is another kind of implicit bias that we can obtain that. But the importance is reaching that point where I can sit with the ambiguity of it. To me, that's the process. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, that's what I need to be doing now, you know, to stay open to whatever is happening at the time, whatever needs to be addressed, like you're saying, to be able to recognize and participate in making those changes. But I'm never going to reach a point where I feel like I'm just, I've reached it. You know, I'm sitting here comfortably. It feels like to me that place of a cultural learning, it's like there's a sharp stick in that chair. You can't sit down, you know, you're going to have to stay in that place of fluid ideas and movements all the time. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. And thank you for sharing that. And I think it's important. I'm taking some notes as people talk, so I may want to come back and visit either now or in the hour that we try to record.
Yeah.
So I'm going to call you KR today, Katie Reynolds, because I have KF also. So Katie Reynolds.
I was wondering how you were going to handle that, so that helps. Because Katie and I have a lot more in common than just our first name, as it turns out. So where to start? I was born in 1990. I think I'm the youngest here. I'm the only millennial. I was born in New Jersey, but moved down here. It's one of the things Katie and I have in common. Moved down here when I was about 4.5 in Richmond, and grew up in Western Henrico, which when I moved there was a little bit country, but has changed a lot. And I was there through its evolution to becoming the short pump that we know it as today. I'm the oldest of 3 kids in my home. And because I was in that area when it was really growing with money, I also had the opportunity. Every school I went to was new, and was thrown all the technology, all the new resources, all of that kind of stuff. Very few people of color around during those years. My family history, though, has been, my grandmother's a part of the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. We can trace our ancestry back, and they've kind of moved north and south, back and forth, but we've been East Coasters pretty much the whole time. So what I do know of my family history is a lot on both sides of the fence, including the Civil War. And within my closer family, I was brought up with, there always seemed like a divide between them. You know, the one side of my family was Republican, much more religious, many more outward statements of judgment towards others, including people of color, and it was just kind of brushed off as, oh, that's their generation, or that's just how it is. The other side, more, democratic, more progressive, supporting of a lot of the activism, but definitely I think that group of, the good white people are thinking of themselves that way. Not a lot of true action behind their statements, but just believing that kind of being in line with that was enough. I think for me, going to college was a huge shift. I was very rebellious as a teenager. I had a lot of rifts with my mother that caused a lot of tension, which at the time was not great, but it ended up causing me to really go out into the world and seek a lot of external feedback, a lot of change. So I went to 2 urban schools. I went to VCU for my undergrad, and then GW in DC for my master's. And I think both of those experiences were really important for me, just being around a more diverse population, different conversations. I don't think it was until grad school that I actually had racial conversations kind of come to me point blank. Some conversation with friends before then, but never, this is a problem and we're going to talk about it. And I think at that point, I had a lot of defensiveness around it. It was very uncomfortable for several years for me. So I don't think it's really until this job that I came here and kind of leaned into that more, and have been working through that in my own ways while I've been here.
That's great. Thank you, KR, for sharing that. That's really some fascinating points that I want to dig back into as we get a little deeper.
Sure.
Bob. So now the first 2 presenters shared the year that they were born. So I'm going to share mine just so I can put that out. So I'm 1958. So if you choose, we'd be welcome to have that. Just give some common context.
1982. So
82?
82. So Jan was 30 and you were
22.
22. I was graduating.
Yeah, something like that.
I was 24. I was graduating from college.
Yeah. And Katie Reynolds was a twinkle in somebody's eye. Yeah, so I was born in South Carolina, and my dad had briefly moved away from the farm and then moved back to the farm. And his parents were very low income, like entrepreneurs, white folks, but he was the first one when he had moved away, and then we did move away, and it really stuck to leave like that 2-county area in nobody really knows how long. And then he married my mom, who was born in Oklahoma, and their family had moved a lot, but that's kind of where their roots were. And similar maybe to what Katie shared, my family kind of has 2 sides. So my father's side from South Carolina, like trace back, it was very important to my dad's mom that she register all of her grandchildren as children of the Confederacy. That means you have an ancestor that fought on the Confederate side in the Civil War. And she was also, she was registered, and all her daughters, granddaughters were registered with the Daughters of the American Revolution, similar to what Katie shared. So it was a real source of like pride and dignity. And then on my mom's side of the family was very much like hardworking Midwestern, had been very impacted by the Great Depression. A lot of the family, including my mom's mom, had gone to California to pick fruit. And so it's interesting, part of growing up with Oklahoma family was very aggressive racial attitudes towards Native American people.
Did you say aggressive or progressive?
Aggressive, like just very intense feelings against Native American people, and very racist attitudes there. And on my dad's side of the family, very kind of racist mindset, but not just very entrenched, almost like not aware of how racist their language and beliefs were towards African American, toward Black communities. And I've often thought how lucky we were that we traveled, we left the farm when I was very young, moved to Oklahoma, and then I mostly grew up in West Virginia, and at a school that was probably, elementary school is maybe 30% African American kids. We lost Katie Francis. And probably 65% Caucasian kids, and then 5% smattering of other folks. And so that, growing up outside of either of my family, like extended family context, was really important. We also moved a good amount. So after West Virginia, we moved to Texas and then to Malaysia, my senior year of high school. And I moved back to go to college and really didn't have like a hometown. And at the time, I longed for that, but I'm also now really grateful that I was in so many different contexts. I was really interested in working for the church, and I did that for a while. I went to a small Christian liberal arts college and studied missions and community development, and then worked for a mission agency doing some community organizing, community resource mapping in Brussels. Left, had a lot of mixed feelings about leaving that job. I was not well cared for, and there was a lot of difficult cultural stuff, and I just felt like I needed to go back to grad school. Ended up at a social work program in St. Louis. And so my experience, as I kind of mentioned in my email, like working for faith-based organizations, and then internship in grad school, and then there in St. Louis for several years afterwards, about 5 years, worked for a feminist organization that was really keyed in on women helping women, survivors of interpersonal violence. And I was the first male they had hired in 40 years. So there was a lot of like a sea change in that organization to like honoring and recognizing that men can be victims of interpersonal violence and engaging men as partners and allies. And so that was a great perspective to bring to ChildSavers, and particularly just to Richmond. I guess generally to Richmond, particularly to ChildSavers. I'd never been somewhere where so many racialized dynamics were so explicit. And it was, St. Louis is a segregated place, but Richmond is more segregated. You know, in St. Louis, I was there when Mike Brown was killed, and there were riots and protests, and I was kind of engaged in some of those things around that event. And even though tensions were high, I felt like I could have lots of conversations and be in dialogue with a lot of different people there, professionally and personally. And Richmond feels much more tense. And so I feel like I've really accelerated my learning and listening around these issues since moving here.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate that very much. Very useful. KF, it's your show.
Hopefully my internet stays stable. 10 minutes. So I also will share, yes, I was born in 1983. I was born in New Jersey. I have spent the first half of my life in New Jersey, primarily outside of a very small amount of time in California when I was about 3 months old. I lived in a suburb of New York City, so I feel like that was a really big part of the culture where I lived. I spent like 8 years in one town, and then my parents moved to, I would say, a more upper class neighborhood, and that was probably from like 3rd grade on until when I went to college. My parents, depending on their parent, they were either 1st or 2nd generation Americans. Everybody had come through Ellis Island. And that was a really big part of my upbringing. And really, I think that was just really a lot of the culture in New Jersey. You know, part of what you used to talk about was like your family background. So my family, I'm half Polish and I'm half Irish. And it was always just, you know, we had projects geared towards that. So it was very much just a part of normal everyday dialogue. For my family too, my dad had his grandfather's Ellis Island papers framed, and that was in his office. And I feel like that was really important to him. Some other things I think that shaped how like my family views themselves is, so my maiden name is Rose. However, that's not actually our family name. So our family came from Poland, and especially during the 1940s and 1950s, there was less tolerance of names sounding really Slavic. So my grandfather and his 3 brothers all changed their names. So our native name is Arizmovich, and they changed it to Rose. And so we are the only Roses, and then 2 of my great uncles changed it to Rosie, and then 1 person kept it. I think that was really interesting. I think really a big part of our family and how we, I think, viewed culture. I think something else that was really present was there was still kind of this reminiscence in where I grew up and where my dad's office was of neighborhoods by ethnicity. And so having neighborhoods where, you know, this was the Polish neighborhood and that was the Croatian neighborhood, and, you know, this was the Puerto Rican neighborhood. And so I think that was always on the periphery for me, but not where I grew up at all. Where I grew up was very, very white. When I think of my family based on their journey to the United States, I think that they pushed a lot of acculturation values. And so for them, their tolerance was very much like you assimilate to the culture, you know. And so a lot of the things that I heard growing up were not directly related to race relations with Black and white, but it was more around like, you need to speak our language. You need to, you know, commenting on dress and food and smells and things like that. And so that was very much a part of what I dealt with. I also lived there during 9/11, and so September 11th, that really, I think, exacerbated a lot of things in my family, a lot of fear around people who could hurt you, who they viewed were threats. You know, it was very, that incident was very present for us. It was, you could see the New York skyline from where we lived. You couldn't see it anymore. You know, where my dad worked, he was very close to New York, and just the ways that the air smelled for weeks afterwards. You know, you could just feel it and smell it. And that was a big change. I definitely, my brother and I are pretty rebellious. We're pretty rebellious. I think I did not connect to my parents' belief system, but I didn't really know that I was totally against it until kind of moving away and exploring and learning about new things. I went to college at JMU, so that was a big culture shock for me, just living, in a suburban New Jersey, northern New Jersey city area to a more rural southern place. And then I think similarly to things that Bob and Katie have said, that I don't think that the impacts of like race relations really came to my direct conscious until moving to Richmond. And even, I would say over the past year, I think that that's really what's shifted for me. There was always it was always there. But I think until I started actively engaging in the learning and actively reading and actively participating in conversations, did everything really start to come into my awareness so dramatically. I think too, just where I am in my life, like having a family has really hit it for me too. Like understanding that, my impact is not just on the people I work with and the people I interact with, but the people that I'm responsible for, helping them create their belief system. And so making sure that I'm educating them and showing them so that they don't have to get to the point where I got to in my life and all of a sudden realize like, oh, what you guys believe is like, it's not okay. And you're furthering a system. So yeah, a little bit about me.
Cool stuff. Cool stuff. I really appreciate you all sharing, not just with me, but with a broader audience. It's a little bit about you. I think it's really important in terms of getting deeply into some of these conversations. As you know, we are engaged in fierce conversations in the agency, and just the feedback that I'm getting are there's several different experiences for people. Some are it's not going well, others it's going very well, and there are a lot of people who are having and sharing things that they have not shared in the past. So each of you has talked about your emergence into the issues of race in ways that I find fascinating, absolutely fascinating, because when I think about race, I think I've been thinking about it since FABA that I can remember and became aware. And that awareness started with my family's move to Churchill in 1958, when the year I was born, and soon after, within a year, we went from the third family on the block who happened to be Black to the entire community, several block community becoming all the white people left, except there was a single block of white people that stayed through my high school years, and eventually they left. So I'm curious about, I'm going to use the word awareness. It may not be the right word, but I'm very interested in this transition to awareness and what that was all about for you. What really drove that? Jan, you talked about the experience overseas in Cambodia. Katie, both Katie's talked about this rebellious nature and pushing up against family values, and both Bob and KDR have these experiences with either the Confederacy or the Daughters of the American Revolution. So Katie, your experience about Slavic people coming to the United States and your Polish and Irish family background. So what was that like? I guess what I'm interested in is what did that feel like for you as this transition was taking place? And Bob, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think it's an important question. I think a lot of it maps onto like child development stages for me, and there's I'm a late bloomer, And there's something, privileged about being able to kind of like wake up to the realities of the world around you when you're ready to do that. And in a way that I think all of us, if we're around children and a television's on, we kind of are aware of like what's on that TV. I think most people can relate to, like, we don't want to expose kids to things they're not ready for, but we do. A lot of families feel like it's a safety thing. They have to have the talk with their kids about if an officer talks to you, or you can't be outside after a certain hour, or whatever is going on in their community. And I just didn't have that. And so for me, I think the steps along the way were like, in elementary school, I was like, typically early elementary, the girls are kind of taller than the boys, except for me. And so I and Stephanie Brewer, I still remember her name, like she was one of the only African-American people in my like grade. And she definitely was the only person my height. And we were just like, we're the same height for first grade, second grade, third grade. And then she slowed down and I just kept getting taller. But it was interesting, like, because we would pal around and sit together and like we were friends, and started to feel like, oh, she has a different perspective on the school and our neighborhoods, the other kids. And then in middle school, I like competed off and on for first chair alto saxophone in the marching band with Sarah Schofield, and she was Black and would have different perspectives. And so it's kind of like through my friendships had this, and then through these punctuated visits to go see relatives, where I would hear people use just language that I would ask, I knew was really bad, like the N-word, and I would ask my parents about it later. And depending on their stress level or something, they would be like, don't talk about that. I'm like, oh, okay, well, I know it's bad. I don't know why. And so there was this kind of like growing up, and like a lot of kids, was kind of like trying to figure it out, because I knew you weren't allowed to ask adults about it. Really what pushed me into like a lot more critical awareness was the move to the fastest growing school district in the country at the time, outside of Houston, when I was a sophomore. And just this like massive churn of like the energy sector just has people moving to and away from Houston constantly. And we were part of that. Dad had an energy job. And so that was really just lots of Vietnamese last names in my school, and like awareness of that, and just being humble of like, I mean, just not humble, just ignorant of like, your last name is Nguyen. How can you tell me how to pronounce it? I don't know. Like, and then we moved to Malaysia, and it was just, we were the people that stood out. And I had this awareness of like always being the ridiculous looking person, like really tall, super skinny, always standing out. And then you move to Malaysia, where the average height is lower than the US, and everyone is some shade of brown. And so like you really, really stand out. And just having to realize I'm a status symbol, like I'm a symbol of wealth, I'm a symbol of privilege, like there's lots of gender dynamics in this country. Whoa. So just having kind of like splashed down there for 6 to 8 months, and then moving back to go to college, like that was kind of like jumping into ice water being there, I think. And had to kind of realize some stuff, and then realize like also around that age, adolescence, like my parents don't have the answers. They have a lot of answers, but the world is changing quickly enough that they don't. I was in college from 2000 to 2004, which is when everybody got some kind of cell phone, and we didn't know what that was. Like my mom was mailing me phone cards that had a pre-charged amount of minutes, and depending on which country, you could get minutes for that country, and that's how we talked to each other. So it was a lot of like the world changing really quickly. My parents don't have all the answers, and I realized like along the way, these stops, like I've had to figure some things out that they weren't able to talk about or help me out with.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Jan, do you want to talk a little bit about
Well, I feel like I left out hearing other people. I'm thinking, I think my first big realization was actually in about third grade when I lived on an Air Force base. So there were kids that were moving. It was a different atmosphere. It wasn't like, well, we all went to the same school from kindergarten through high school. And that was helpful because kids knew they had to be open with each other. But there was only one black kid in my whole class, and even at that age, I was aware that the teacher picked on him. He was kind of a daydreamer, very imaginative kid, played lots of really interesting imaginative games. And I remember feeling very protective of him and punching a few kids sometimes. Just that awareness that this wasn't right. And then I think by high school, when dating a black student, realized my parents really were racist. And I think that started our great divide of rebelliousness. We were never in sync through high school or college or ever really politically. My big eye-opener was in junior high when I took a trip to the United Nations with a church group, with Methodist Church, went to the UN every year. And that's what made me realize, oh man, the rest of the world is out there and they don't believe like we do. It's kind of more at that international level that I had that first eye-opener by talking to some people at the United Nations who worked with other countries were telling us, well, no, the US really isn't doing good stuff in the world, and kind of getting it from that international perspective, but then bringing it back to, working locally with what was going on in the States, where the US wasn't doing good in the world, in their own country, based on poverty and the inequities that were just everywhere, but particularly, for minorities in the US.
Thanks, Jen. KDR.
Whew. This question makes me already feel nervous. I think I feel a lot of embarrassment about the answer. Growing up, I honestly don't remember thinking about it at all. I think there were a few people of color in schools, classes, grades along the way. But one of the things that's always stood out as interesting to me, hearing from people of color and particularly parents of color, is that protection comes from talking about it, right? Early, this is what it is, and this is kind of how you move through the space, this is how you deal with it, this is how you stay safe. And my experience was the exact opposite. I think the part of the protection was not talking about it. We didn't talk about anything hard, frankly. If it was hard, it was something you don't discuss. So I don't think there were ever conversations of race in any way that I can really remember at all. When I got to high school, I will say I do recall the guy that I dated most of through high school was considered in some way someone who might have been kind of like a metrosexual, like wigger was the term that I remember people using. Somebody who took on some of Black culture. That's some of what I remember with high school was more awareness of Eminem and these kinds of folks who had clearly stolen a lot of Black culture. But I didn't read it that way at the time. I read it as something separate. I really couldn't explain to you exactly why, but that's how it came through my brain. I think it always felt very separated, very different. Growing up in Richmond when I was really young, Richmond City was not somewhere you went. When I was really young, it was we were the murder capital of the country for a little while, and it was not somewhere you went. I came downtown for like baseball games or maybe to a museum field trip, but that was about it until it started getting safer. And then my family would come down more. VCU was really like the most time I'd spent downtown for years. And so I think even there, I was exposed to people of different races more, but again, I think I was still not in a place where I saw it differently or saw it as, I didn't see people be treated differently. You know what I mean? Like I think I knew my father was he majored in history and he always loved history. So we got brought around to battlefields and we learned a lot about history, but we learned about it from a white perspective. I don't remember ever really, outside of knowing that like civil rights happened, I don't really remember ever thinking about the clash differently. It was kind of like slavery's gone now, civil rights already happened, and that's kind of it. So for me, I think I kind of avoided it in a lot of ways. Some of that came to a little bit more of a head when I lived with a friend of mine for a number of years in college, who was a Black man from Jamaica. And he had come to school. His parents had sent him and his brothers here to come to private school and go to the US for college and that kind of stuff. So he had been in America for a long time. And sometimes I would hear his perspective around some of these things, but I think that was also limited. You know, I don't know how much of that he wanted to share with me, or actually, I think knowing him, the person that he is, I think he probably wanted to also maybe shield me from some of that and let me be naive and ignorant in my space. So I really don't think it was until graduate school is really when I remember, I mean, I had a multicultural or cultural awareness centered class, only one, by the way, the entire time I was there. And that was really the moment that it confronted for me, because there weren't things before that. And I really remember it being very uncomfortable, and being very upset at first, in a defensive way, I didn't appreciate, I could not fully understand why white people as a group were talked about differently. I think that was a really big moment for me, but I think I really internalized that with a lot of defensiveness, a lot of conflict for several years. I think honestly, until I moved back to Richmond this last time and worked in this context. I remember coming to ChildSavers on that first couple of weeks. Dr. Moon came, and it was great for me. Really, really great. Thank you guys. And I remember thinking, I was like, wow, these people are like really serious about this. Like, I didn't think it was a big, huge thing. And then, getting into the schools and seeing it differently firsthand. It's a picture of Richmond that I really had not seen before, even though I lived here as long as I have. And I think it was through that, Bob, I know you and I talked about it at great lengths, but there's been a few particular clients along that path that there are just these points where I was like, there's something here that I'm not understanding, like there's something that they know that I don't know. And it took me a while. I don't think it was just about being Black, but cultural components of that, and particularly in the neighborhoods that these folks lived in. It took me some of that to really say, I have to do something different here.
Katie? F.
I think I connect with a lot of what has been said so far. I was gonna say, Bob, talking about a late bloomer, I feel like this for me was like a really, really late blooming. And I think, some of what Katie had said too, I think growing up, some of this stuff was in my periphery, and even, a lot of it was very covert. And I think there were moments of overt racism, but they were like blips in my world on the screen. And so it was, I would pay attention to it, and I would say to myself, like, that doesn't feel right, but I kept it moving. And actually, as everybody was just talking, I started reflecting on how I find it really interesting. My family grew up Catholic, and you have this like, do unto others as you would want people to do to yourself mentality. And I think about that and how in some hypocritical that can be, within that church, and also within that, like within my family system. Just really, would you want to treat people the way that you're talking about them right now? I think as I grew up, like the more overt moments were my grandparents becoming more elderly, and I think less censored in their thoughts. And so I think at those moments it was kind of like, whoa, Nanny, that was inappropriate. And then going to college and just being, I think, around a different group of people with different experiences. My college roommate is Filipino, and learning about her and her life experiences was wild. And I was so nervous about living with somebody you didn't know And the way that we bonded, it's really funny how we bonded. It's like we were both sitting in our offices very quietly, and somebody passed gas, and then we both just started cracking up, and just this moment of like, oh, that was the tension breaker. And then we just, like really start to learn about each other and hang. But I lived in a really small dorm, and just, I think that was also the first moments of hearing someone who really ascribed to those Southern values and those very racist values, of hearing some people say those words to me, and it was like, whoa. I used to joke around with my friends from New Jersey, like I'd be like, don't they know the North won? You lost the war, like stop talking about it. And I just remember thinking those things. And then I think the next moment was going to VCU and being in a more urban school environment and having our social justice class. That class terrified me. It was, my professor still practices in the field, Jimmy Christmas, and he loves to stir the pot. And he would go in and say things, and I had a lot of really strong, powerful voices in my class, and they would fight with him on the daily. And I would just sit in the back, and it was probably the first time I had been in a class where white individuals were not the majority. I think it was probably more equal, but it was still that first moment of like, I am not in the majority, and I am feeling very wrong, and I think that if I say anything, I'm gonna offend people. I remember having to stand up and do a presentation in that class and being paralyzed with fear of like that moment where you dissociate outside of your body because you're like, I think I might pass out, and if I stay in my body, I'm gonna pass out. So I'm gonna leave my body for a minute and try and have this conversation. It was just really, really, really rubbed and pushed. And then I think it's working at this agency and having people have conversations with me. I think that, and even, you and I have had many conversations, Robert, and I think some of my supervisees really pushed me, but it's been a journey of like, just paying attention and really starting to put things together and really like, just, I think for me, it's just paying attention, really paying attention. I think the other times I was not.
So I want to dig a little bit because it's now 2:00, and some of the stuff that we shared is pretty intense about you all's, or what I'm describing self, when you describe and talk about yourself and your upbringing. And then the second question was really around awakening. You came to this realization that, oh wow, the world is not just my oyster, if you will. It's a broader thing. So I want to ask one more question, and then I want to dig a little more deeply into the ChildSavers work. And so I think this is important because when you all talked about self, you were really comfortable. And this is my observation. So my observation, you were really comfortable and sort of describing here's how it was, even though some of the stuff that I experienced was a little bit uncomfortable, but you had an easy time talking about that. When you began to talk about the awakening, you talked about not necessarily discomfort in the moment, but the discomfort at that moment. And what I'm really curious about is when you put your line in the sand for the first time, and you really had to say, this is wrong. It's Congressman Lewis's, when you see something, say something. And what was that like? Because I have a follow-up to that. So I'm going to sort of take a, Jan, why don't you go first?
I'm going to step in the next room. I'm so sorry, Jan. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Well, I feel like, the first line was being in 3rd grade, but I didn't really know what the line was about. I think I felt protective of that other student because my brother had a physical disability. He had a birthmark on his face. So I always felt very protective of anyone, who approached him and treated him differently. So then when I saw it happening to this other kid based on his color, I just kind of stepped into that role as a kid. But I can't say I knew, what that was about, other than feeling protective of anyone who was seen as different. Mm-hmm. I think the next big one was in high school you know, when I dated, someone wanted to date me, and then my parents, who supposedly were not racist, were, and that you know, it's a huge division for me with them and the family.
Mm-hmm.
And that continued, you know, for the rest of our adult lives. I feel fortunate. My brother, I had an older brother who also was very politically minded, so I had an ally. You know, I had someone who kind of led the way, and connecting with his friends. We were 3 years apart, kind of gave me that courage. But you know, I did a lot of protesting during college, so I guess those were drawing the lines, not so much around race, but around political unfairness. You know, that was around the Vietnam War and people being drafted. So I don't know if that counts for what you're saying in terms of realizing political injustices and economic injustices that create a situation where, you know, Black guys are being drafted at a much higher rate. And we in college, did some draft counseling and talking to Black men, you know, about my same age, and realizing they saw that as the only opportunity to have an economic boost to get out of the poverty they were in, and kind of feel, you know, seeing that conflict of a totally different world than what I knew. I mean, my family was poor growing up, but my brother and I were the first ones. My parents worked to bring us up to middle class level, you know, so we as little kids were poor, but by that time, you know, we're in college. I mean, had that luxury. I think that's where I started feeling these real internal conflicts. I could be self-righteous about what I believed about the war, but other people didn't have that luxury, you know, so.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'm glad you shared the different views of the Black young men who were going to war for economic enterprise. They needed to work and have a stable career, even though they could be headed to their
Yeah.
And we know many of them were and did pass away. Katie F.
There we go. I think over the past couple of years, I would walk up to the line and then like stand near it, but I never, up until probably this past year, have actually stood on the line and said, I'm here and I'm staying here. And I think for me, that was, I read something a friend posted, and it's funny, it was like, I think the title of it was like Katie, 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 written a couple different ways, ironically. And it was like, white women stop doing this, and just reading through like this narrative around stop making it about you and your anger and your feelings about things, and start checking in on the people who are experiencing these things, and just stop making it about yourself and your outrage, was something that really was just really this eye-opening moment for me. And I think from there, you know, both my husband and I are having these like parallel conversations in our workplaces, and so us being able to come together and talk about it, and then us also having really frank conversations about how we want to raise our kids. And so, you know, making a commitment to not just read these things, have these beliefs, but also correct others when they are wrong is really kind of our commitment now, and not hiding in our family, you know, when if we're going to have conversations with our family members, being open and saying these are our beliefs, and just really being firm on that. So.
Katie, I'm going to push a little bit, may I?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it may surprise you that I would think that realization hit you now and not before. Why do you think that is?
I think I was coming to it over the past couple of years, and maybe I think running towards it faster this year. But I think it was reading that article, and then also this like feeling of like, what can I do? I don't know what to do. What do I do? And I think when I started thinking about what I could do, it was this piece around like, you are educating two little humans and you're helping them create their values. And so make sure that you're directing them in the right direction and you're exposing them to things. And so that instead of, I think prior to that, it was always like, I'm not sure if I can share this information with them. I don't know what kind of books, like not having really overt conversations about race. And I think it was also just the piece around like feeling a really strong responsibility to make sure that my kids get a full education and really begin to that we begin to approach these topics with them from a very young age. And so making sure that we're reading books about it and we're having conversations and talking about it. And the part of it too is because I live in a county that is not diverse and definitely leans to the side of not talking about racial inequity and celebrating lots of Confederate heritage to the point of, what I would consider overt racism. So it's just recognizing that if I can't change where my kids go to school and where they live, then I am going to work as hard as I can to make sure that they hear my voice and hear our value systems, and that our unit will create a value system that is based on understanding racial reconciliation and working towards a future of hopefully equality, maybe when they're older.
Yeah. So I want to build on that across the board. I'm sort of changing my way because I'm afraid to lose connection again. But I think that's an interesting perspective in terms of looking at your family unit and saying, I want to make sure that the value systems in my family unit is I can build upon that and make it great for my children and for us as parents. But I'm wondering, and this can be to anybody, not specifically to Katie, but I'm wondering what does it look like as you go through this value systems change to look at systems change, not just in your personal life, but what does it look like systemically? You live in a county, Katie, in your example, that has this history of supporting the Confederacy. So what does that look like in terms of what you do and what you decide going forward around issues like that? You don't specifically have to answer. It could be open to anybody.
Yeah. I think the quick answer for me is being more active in politics, being more active in movements, and not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. And so going to meetings and signing petitions and joining up with organizations that are promoting highlighting the inequities that are there and making steps towards change.
Cool. I'm curious, Bob, what do you think?
The things that come to mind when I think about systems are I think personally, it's hard to say it theoretically, but personally, because we moved so much, I have a special skill. I don't know if you all knew this. of being able to jump into a system and very quickly figure out what I'm supposed to do, what the rules are, how to blend in. And I'm never going to be great at blending in. Like, I'm never going to be doing field work for the CIA because of my body shape and personality, whatever. But I can blend as much as I can. And we can move, and I can find a way through the cafeteria the first or second day of school at a public school. Like, that happened to me a good amount. I think in terms of this work of system change is like turning that inside out and saying, and training in my master's program really emphasized this, like, okay, if this is what we're organized around, what's missing? And so that's really important for me. It's hard to hear what's not being said, but to just look at, like, okay, how are we supposed to swim, go with the flow here? If we do that, what are we leaving out? And just in mental health care, it's often the voices of consumers of service consumers. That's a great example of something like people don't think of until somebody brings it up. So I think about that kind of listening for what's not happening is also really important in like family therapy. So some of this is like copying something from professional training and applying it to other kinds of systems. And I think too, one of the like drawing the line conversations to your other question was like with my parents, who were very much like, you know, you're going to be pre-med and we've gone over this and like, we'd like you to earn a lot of money. That's That's all you got to do. It's just earn a lot of money. We'll die happy. It's fine. And the first line was saying, I want to study community development because I feel like poverty is evil, and we all have to like really work to preserve, protect, promote like human dignity of all people. And then later was like, I'm going to get a social work degree and get like another, and they're like, okay, this again. But I get a lot of opportunities because I'm a cisgender, able-bodied, white, male, above average height, whatever those things are that tend to correlate with earning more. And so a skill for me in that is like finding ways to share the mic and figuring out who are your role models, like who are you staying close to like learn from, because that's not going to naturally be a person of color. The mic isn't naturally going to get shared. Most systems don't automatically do that. You have to really watch and think about it.
I'm curious because I want to build upon that, and Bob, this is broadly to the group. This concept of share the mic is a interesting concept and wonderful concept in many senses. But I think about how do you create permanence? How do you make this permanent? We're having a conversation today in 2020 about sharing the mic. Is the story really sharing, or is it really listening and putting forth the views of folks on your mic, if you will? Any thoughts from anybody on that?
I have a couple.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. For me, I think it comes down to a lot of self-reflection of how I show up in the systems that I operate in, and therefore, I don't know about anybody else, but when I think of systems, I'm like, oh, they're so big, I can't influence them. There's nothing I can do, and it feels like an easy space to give up. But that's not really true. And so I start to think about what actions I am doing currently and what things I could be doing differently to help shift that system and invite more people of color to come in with closer proximity. And so kind of to like what you were saying, I think it's a little bit of both, I guess. One, making sure that there is a space for them at the table and doing what we can to make that happen permanently. And then two, also, using your platform when you have it to share their voices, their needs. So.
I think embedded in this idea around sharing the mic is this whole concept of coming to the table. And maybe the idea is not coming to the table, but creating a new table, and going to the table rather than coming to the table, bringing people to the table. I think one of the things we have talked about as an organization is your network and who's in your network, because that's as important a piece as anything. And can you all talk about your personal networks and how you use that for systems change or to change you as an individual?
Yeah, I think for me too, it comes back to this thing I'm telling myself is just constantly challenging the status quo of things. And I think up until recently, I just kind of status quo was what it was. And so why do we do the things we do? Why do we push the treatment modalities that we push? Why do we network in the way that we do? And really taking a step back and thinking about the why. So that's one thing. And I am really trying hard to expand my network, and it's hard. And it's really pushing myself outside of that and saying like, and each time thinking like, what could I be doing differently to expand? How can I get, how do I make connections? How do I put myself in situations that I'm uncomfortable in to build those connections? And also, I think tolerating rejection too. Like, you may want to make connections and people may not want to make connections with you. And so that's another thing just to kind of prep and think.
Add in on that too. There's something I've been thinking about recently about, in my mind, I'm like, yes, absolutely. I would love more people of color in my life. In general, I think that's a need. But then I also don't want to to go into tokenism and to be creating relationships for the sake of having more people of color in my life. So I think there's also a quality of like genuineness of relationships too that I struggle with, where I want those, but I don't want someone to feel used also for my benefit, you know. So that's one of the issues I'm struggling with right now personally too.
Can I push on that a little bit?
Yeah.
Because I think that's an important concept. This feeling around tokenism and bringing people in just for the purpose. It may feel like that today, but if we don't take a step in that direction, even if it feels like tokenism, we'll never get to the point that we are starting to invite people in. I would suggest, and this wasn't about me suggesting, but I would suggest to you that in order for Black folks, and I can speak to that one only, to survive, we've had to do tokenism with white people to get them in our lives so that we could move forward. So it's the same concept. It's if you really want to do this work, you've got to engage these people who are not like you in order to even begin to get there. So I would suggest that you might want to think about that a little more and put it on the table. You know, this may feel like tokenism, but I'm really trying to move and accept the fact that, to Katie's point, that people say, not now. and what I discovered is, well, I think what many of us of color have discovered is maybe not now, but we'll just keep pushing.
I've been challenged along the way to think about my theory of change. And I think because it's uncomfortable, a lot of folks, particularly white folks, have a very simple theory of change on this issue, and that it's proximity. If I'm close to people of color, then I will improve. And so I think about, you know, similar kind of hesitation as Katie Reynolds, not holding back from proximity, but not having that be the only way I can move forward. I know actually a lot of Black folks in my life have said proximity with white folks, white institutions, whatever, has been very painful and harmful in some ways. And so thinking about it in a systems way and in a like communication loop way of like, how can I be selective about just discerning with like, who are people who have identified themselves as a resource. I can be super proximate to them. I can approach, they've said, you know, I'm an author, I write on these issues, I have a talk show, or I'm signaling this socially in your social circles, like, oh, great. I'm gonna explicitly be close to them. And then like implicitly, informally, financially, like all the other ways, I can do a lot myself, not by myself, but like I can get close to and join and pay membership dues to groups in my community that are really within my arm's reach. A little bit less about like, hey, can we have a coffee date? And I want to process some stuff about race with you, Robert, which may be a complicated time. Although I think I feel pretty comfortable hanging out with you in that capacity, but it's a different thing than also like, am I reading like historic and contemporary authors on this issue? Am I engaging, like doing some of that paradigm work too? And then thinking too about what are the people who are proximate or distal to me? Like, are there people within arm's reach that I have a microphone with, or I'm within earshot of these people socially, naturally, and I'm not listening to them? Maybe I'm so busy wanting to go learn and do the racism work that I'm ignoring the person right here next to me, that I'm friends with or neighbors with, or whatever. So it's also like, are my eyes open to the people I'm already in dialogue with? But I want some special conversation about race to fix my race problem so people won't say I'm racist. And so I'm focused on some other thing, but like I'm in the community. And like Katie said, I think serving in Richmond Public Schools and really, it's sometimes having really thankless position in those schools has taught me as much or more than explicit conversations with people about their experiences.
Gentlewomen and men, I am very appreciative of the fact that you all, one, volunteered to do this, and two, shared some stuff. I'm not sure we got there, but I think we did. I think we explored some areas that I think the public would be interested in knowing about your thinking as individuals, but us a little bit as an organization. And I think this time of exploring, learning, and doing something is an important time for all of us in our community. And I think we can't stop. And, I'll end by saying this. As the organization's first CEO of color, it has been a great journey. And I hope one that will last a little longer for me as we go through this period of important change as we seek to improve the lives of children and the families around them. So I want to thank you all for the honest conversation. Much appreciated. And I hope to individually have some follow-up conversations